The Sunday school lesson for November 3rd, 2024 is Jonah Repents. Jonah chapter 2, verses 1 through 10. Welcome, viewers and subscribers to my channel, Read With Me. I am Audrey. If you are new here, please know that this is an audio reading of the Sunday school lesson. Every Sunday at 1 o'clock Central Standard Time, I release a new audio for the upcoming Sunday school lesson. Thank you so much for everything that you do to help this channel grow one viewer and one subscriber at a time. Accepting the situation. Jonah chapter 2, verses 1 through 4. Praying in the fish. Jonah chapter 2, verse 1. This is the first time we read about Jonah praying, even though he had previously received direction from God. What we see so far is a prophet who was not receptive to God's leading and will in his life. This is difficult to comprehend, for the Lord's Old Testament prophets and their ministries are generally presented in a positive light. This serves as a warning to guard against selfish attitudes and actions in our lives. The encouraging note, however, is that Jonah's prayer reveals some spiritual growth and maturity. We cannot tell what it was exactly that got hold of his heart and brought about the change. Up to this point in time, Jonah had been fleeing from God and trying to hide from him. Now, during his time of great stress, he sought him. Was it a fear of drowning? Did his near-death experience, the miraculous storm, or the conditions inside the fish cause him to realize how disobedient he was being and give him a healthy fear of God? No situation is ever completely hopeless for God's children. We are assured several times in his word that nothing is impossible for him. Matthew chapter 19, verse 26, Luke chapter 1, verse 37. Even when our disobedience causes the situation, he reaches out and is ready to act on our behalf. Crying out to God. Jonah chapter 2, verses 2 through 3. Jonah's prayer was not for deliverance. It was a prayer of thanksgiving for not drowning. He faced a certain death when he was thrown into the sea. So when he was swallowed by the large fish, it was a spectacular rescue. Verse 1 reminds us that the Lord was still Jonah's God, so it was to him that Jonah prayed. He described it as crying out to him because of the affliction he was experiencing. He had evidently been praying while in the water. Jonah's description of the surroundings includes the belly of hell, the deep, the midst of the seas, the floods, and all thy billows and thy waves. Putting all the phrases together gives us the impression of being buried alive in the sea. It is a portrayal of an impossible and hopeless situation unless God steps in. The word translated hell refers to Sheol, the place for the dead. It is often translated as grave, hell, or pit. It is the deepest of depths. Verse 2 consists of two parallel phrases, each of which says Jonah cried out to God and was heard. The first phrase tells why he cried, and the second tells where he cried from. Verse 3 explains the causes of this crying. God had hurled him into the sea and its depths. He did not blame the sailors, but recognized the hand of God in what had been done. Reasoning about the future. Jonah chapter 2, verse 4. The verb in verse 2 was cried, an indication of desperation. The verb here is said, suggesting that Jonah had reached some level of calmness enough that he could reason more clearly. In fact, a major turnaround in his thinking is evident here. After acknowledging that God had cast him out of his sight, Jonah expressed confidence in once again being able to look toward God's holy temple. Jonah was echoing Solomon's prayer at the temple dedication, in which he asked God to hear all prayers directed toward the temple and to respond with forgiveness. Many Old Testament saints followed Solomon's pattern. Nehemiah chapter 1 verse 6, Psalms 5 and 7, Daniel chapter 6 verse 10. Changing his thinking. Jonah chapter 2 verses 5 through 7. Describing his conditions. Jonah chapter 2 verses 5 through 6. Jonah reflected on what he had already been through and was continuing to experience. The waters that surrounded him were probably both those that engulfed him when he was thrown into the sea and those that kept coming into the fish's stomach. What exactly did Jonah mean when he wrote that the waters compassed me about, even to the soul, in verse 5? It could have been akin to saying he was in waters up to his neck, or perhaps he was saying he felt close to death. He also said that the deep waters completely engulfed him to the point that seaweed got wrapped around his head. The way Jonah describes his experience, the physical reality of sinking to the bottom of the sea and then being swallowed by a fish, seems to be an image of what he experienced emotionally. What hope for salvation could there possibly be in the belly of a fish? Jonah's situation certainly seemed impossible. In spite of the hopelessness, he still expressed assurance that God would lift him out of that pit. His prayer was ascending to Yahweh, the covenant keeping God of Israel, who was still his Lord. Remembering his God. Jonah chapter 2, verse 7. The word remembered indicates Jonah's changing thought patterns. We can sense the change in Jonah's spirit as he reflected on God and his faithfulness to his servants. Jonah had come to the place where he remembered the Lord. This Hebrew word does not indicate that Jonah had forgotten God existed, but now remembered him. Rather, it means that Jonah's knowledge about God was beginning to affect the way he thought and acted. Jonah reflected on the God who notices the needs of his children and willingly does something about them. And this changed his mindset. In spite of his current surroundings, he remembered that God was faithful and trustworthy and thus able to deliver him if he so desired. Because of that, he was able to pray to him, knowing he would be heard. Prior to this, everything Jonah had experienced had been down. We saw in Jonah, excuse me, we saw in Jonah chapter 1 that he had gone down to Joppa after hearing God's command to go to Nineveh, verse 3. He had gone down into a ship that would take him into the opposite direction. During the storm, he was down in the hold of the ship where he had lain down to sleep, verse 5. Soon he was going down into the waters of the sea, verse 15. And inside the fish, he felt himself going down to the ocean depths. Now, Jonah said that his prayer went up into the temple of God. Knowing God's love. Jonah chapter 2, verses 8 through 10. Comparing beliefs. Jonah chapter 2, verses 8 through 9. In Jonah's calm state of mind, he was able to reflect on the worthlessness of following false gods instead of the true God. They were powerless to help Jonah. When we read in verse 8 that people who follow worthless gods forsake their own mercy, the Hebrew word chase is used for mercy. This word is often used to describe the fact that God is a covenant-keeping God who will always be loyal in his relationship with his children. The word has been understood to mean loyal love. To believe in anything other than God is to walk away from a loyal God who is always faithful in exchange for worthless idols that cannot save. This is an empty pursuit. Jonah's fresh realization of this truth caused him to declare his renewed desire to praise the Lord and be obedient to him. From this, we can see that Jonah was back on track in his walk with God. He had tried running from him and his revealed will, but to no avail. After recognizing the impossibility of escaping God's presence, he cried out in submission and expressed his restored determination to do what God wanted. We are going to see, however, that Jonah was just as human as we are. Exiting the fish, Jonah chapter 2, verse 10. God responded immediately. It had taken some time for Jonah to come around to a realization that running from God is the wrong way to live life. Sometimes we have to hit the bottom before we look up, and this was literally true in Jonah's case. God's response was to order the fish to vomit Jonah out onto dry land. By some means, God caused the fish to vomit after guiding it to the exact spot where he wanted it to give up its traveling companion. Even this was evidence of the sovereign hand of God involved in the situation. Sometimes God uses the most unusual circumstances to accomplish his will. God's love for Jonah shines clearly in Jonah chapter 2. Sometimes that love leads through hard times, but our God can be trusted. Thank you so very much for listening. Join me soon for the next audio reading of the Sunday School lesson. Stay safe and may God bless.